Now let us learn about the DBMS component modules. So these are the various kinds of users, like there might be DBA, casual users, application programmers, and parametric users. So here the commands are getting executed, and here a lot more other procedures happen. Let us see everything one by one. The DBA executes DDL commands. These pass through DDL compiler and get stored in the system catalog. They might also run some privileged commands which pass through the runtime DB processor, and then they are stored into the database. The casual users pass a query, passes through query compiler, query optimizer, and then runtime database processor. A processor processes it, and then it gets updated in the database. Application programmers, they have the programs. They run a pre-compiler, and then the DML compiler comes into the scene. The queries are then becoming compiled transactions, and then after that they pass through the processor, and then the changes are done in the database. The pre-compiler might also send the data to the host language compiler that will send the compiled transactions to the DB processor. The parametric users, they run the compiled transactions, pass through the processor, and the changes are then done at the database side. The DB processor is in constant uh, data passing, that is, it constantly interacts with the store data manager, and input and output of the data also takes from the database. Meanwhile, concurrency control, backup, recovery systems are also put in place by DB processor. So DBMS utilities, DBMS helps me to load the data into the files, backup of the data, reorganizing the data into various file structures, then report generation, performance monitoring, other functions like sorting of data, user monitoring, data compression, all these are enabled by a DBMS package. Now let us understand DBMS architecture. It could be a centralized architecture. So under centralized architecture, everything gets combined into a single system. That is the DBMS software, application programs, user interface, whatever it would be. It's all in a single system itself. The users connect through a remote terminal, but the entire processing is done at the centralized place. So this is the centralized state, the centralized site, and the users access using a terminal. The database, the application programs, everything is available at this site. It's only the monitor which is available elsewhere, and there are several monitors. That means there can be several users. So this is an example of a centralized architecture. Here, everything goes in one system, only accessing is done elsewhere. The another one is client server architecture. Now, under client server architecture, there will be some special servers for print server, file server, DBMS server, web server, email server will be there. Those servers are there, and the clients are different. The clients will have application programs, and they can access the database. So the clients will be provided with interfaces through a client software module, and they can access the server resources. The clients may be diskless machines, or they might have disks. Diskless means no storage is there. Disks means they have some storage. They connect to the servers via some kind of network. So now this is an example of a two tier client server architecture. There are various clients, and then there are various servers. The client are given interfaces so that they can access the uh, services from the servers. So this is how physically it looks like. See, these are the clients, this is the communication network, and this is the server. Client, this is a client with disk. So this is a diskless client. Diskless client means no storage. Client with disk. This is a server. This houses both server and a client. So there are of various nature and they all communicate with each other via the network. So this is how it physically looks like. Now let us understand what is the two-tier architecture for DBMS. So in two-tier architecture for DBMS, we have the user interface. So the client will interact with the server for data. The client will have the interface with which it can interact with the server for the data. This server is also referred to as query server or transaction server, because it gives us the two functionalities, that is, it executes the query and it performs the transaction. In RDBMS, we also call it SQL server, because in RDBMS we run structured query language. So now, if the once the connection is created using ODBC APIs, that is using open database connectivity, and it provides the API, I can communicate with the DBMS. So, like for example, in C I use ODBC, in Java I make use of JDBC. So there are various vendors and their drivers which will help me to connect, and once I connect I can uh, run the query at the server end and get the result at the client end. If we take a three-tier architecture, under a three-tier architecture there is an intermediate layer called the application server or web server. Now this has the business logic. So like for example, consider some user is not allowed to access a particular video because they are not subscribed to that service. So in that case the business logic comes in between, that helps me to understand and to put any kind of rules and regulations or to do some kind of processing in between the client and the server. So there is client and there is server, but in between there is a business logic in between, or I might call it application server. So it sends partially processed data from the client, does little more processing on it. If it is correct, passes it to the server. If it is wrong, passes it to the client. So here, this is how the architecture looks like. There is GUI or the web interface, or it is also called as application layer. And here I will have the application programs or the web pages. Now this is my business logic layer because I have the applications over here. So some processing over here, the partially processed data comes to this, it processes it further. In case if it is right, it passes over here. If it is wrong, it sends back a message to the interface. On this side there is presentation layer, the business logic layer, and the database services layer.